So, what makes a great coach? I think there are two factors to explore. Factor one, their ability to create a culture that brings out the best performance and experience possible for the team, for the group. Factor two is their ability to coach individuals, to coach the individual to bring out their best performance and to help them grow as people. The great coaches, the really great ones, are able to take dysfunctional, toxic cultures and turn them around, or they're able to take really complex cultures and create something extraordinary. Also, I'd say that great coaches are able to coach the uncoachable athletes, the ones that other coaches can't seem to reach, like the Dennis Rodman of the Chicago Bulls so many years ago. But they're also able to coach the really complex individuals, the Michael Jordans of the world. Now, up until recently, I've never really thought about how these two factors, these two things, coaching individuals and coaching the team, can be so very different. And yet the best coaches, they seem to be able to do both. And that's what we're going to unpack in today's episode of the Coaching Culture Podcast. Welcome to the podcast. My name is JP Nervin, and I'm joined by my co-host, Betsy Butterick and Nate Sanderson. The mission of this podcast is to help coaches become better leaders and build better cultures. To learn more about our work as leadership coaches and facilitators, or to check out our online courses and books, go to tocculture.com and betsybutterick.com. Also, at tocculture.com, you can subscribe to the weekly newsletter where you will get the notes to every episode of the podcast and our weekly article and culture builder. Lastly, please be sure to share the podcast with a friend in leadership or in coaching, and then have a conversation with them about it. Don't just share it. This is one of the best things that you can do, I think, to help promote not just our work, but to help promote the culture that you're coaching in. We don't want just a lot of listeners. We want to help people start conversations in their clubs, in their athletic departments, within their coaching staffs, and on their coaching teams. And it's so incredible when we hear the stories of how coaches are not just listening to podcasts, but are listening with other coaches and having discussions around the topics that we discuss. We're just sharing our perspectives, and we definitely aren't always right, but we're committed to getting better. And that's what we're about. And I know that's what you all are about.
Well, last week on the podcast, we had the good fortune of having a conversation with Shaka Smart, the head men's basketball coach at Marquette University. And on our way out the door, he mentioned a phrase that has really stuck with me since that interview, where he said, kind of in passing, that coaching your team and coaching your players are two different things. And when he said that, it really made me reflect a little bit on just what he means by that. That's not something that I've ever really thought very deeply about. I think we do it naturally as coaches. And at the same time, I don't know that I've ever really spent a lot of time kind of identifying how am I coaching our team versus how am I coaching the individuals on our team, particularly when it comes to culture. And so Betsy and JP, we've been chatting about this here and exchanging messages for the last week or so kind of on this subject. And I'm just curious to get our conversation started today. What were some of your initial reflections when we heard Shaka kind of drop this idea here that coaching your team and coaching your players are two different things?
Similar to you, Nate, I hadn't actually thought about that in that way before, and it was a bit surprising. I think my first reaction was, well, yeah, of course. And then my second reaction was, but if you're coaching the individuals, then you are coaching the team, because the team doesn't exist without the pieces. And then I flash back to the movie Miracle, and I'm thinking about, when they're skating endlessly and the coach is asking that one question, who do you play for? And finally, the answer that ends it is Team USA, right? So it's like putting the team in this ecosystem above all. And how much time do we really spend as coaches being intentional about, in this context or at this time or for this purpose, I am coaching the team versus I am coaching a player within the team. So I thought it was a really interesting concept to start to think about.
Yeah, and instantly my mind kind of went to a place where I guess my feeling is that coaches probably, when it comes to culture and team cohesion, they spend more time trying to just coach the team rather than coach individuals within that. team culture within that environment. And I think a lot of the maybe strategies as reflecting on even just my book, The Culture System, and I think a lot of things are about trying to separate that there's moments where, hey, you need to sit down with players and set individual standards that are helping to stretch them when it comes to cultural behaviors that you would want them to grow in when it comes to leadership and discipline and accountability, competitiveness. And that is the best way to drive those individuals forward, which will benefit the team. But I think too often coaches are addressing behavioral standards, within the team. They're so much of their communication just goes to the whole team rather than the individuals that need to hear that message. One of the best examples of this, I think, is when players aren't meeting standards, coaches jump in and kind of give the whole team a lecture, even if it's just one or two individuals, right? And so that can be a complex scenario that we could unpack in this episode. But yeah, I think that the big thing I see when it comes to culture and leadership is that we coach too often the team when there needs to be more individual communication, individual relationship building.
Yeah, I think that tracks with my kind of my coaching journey as well, JP, where, when I first started 20 years ago, I didn't really think about coaching individuals to meet our standards. Like, we laid out the standards. You're going to be in practice on time. We're going to work hard. Here are the expectations. And then we would discipline, or we would have consequences if they don't meet them. But we never really thought about how we would coach individuals, especially those that are falling short, to meet a standard. And when I think about, just what's common in basketball, and I'm sure this is across all sports, and we think about skill development, like there's team season, right? Like during the year where we're doing a lot of team concepts, but there's also the off season when we're spending a lot of time in individual skill development so that our players are learning the skills that will match the system to make the team effort in season obviously be as effective as possible. But I don't really, and I'm just reflecting on my own here, like I don't really see myself doing that from a culture perspective of investing that much time in coaching individuals to be able to grow maybe outside of our leadership council. I think we do some of that, but it just, I think for me, has kind of revealed a place where that's probably a good area for me to start thinking about, in this off season, about how do we coach players, particularly on the culture side, to reach some of those expectations, particularly if they are maybe struggling or falling short.
And as you're talking, and I'm thinking about, what JP mentioned, the culture, the leadership side, and you're saying, okay, reflecting on my own coaching journey, I don't know how much time we spend on the individual culture coaching, but that would really be a great investment of time. And for me, through a communication lens, it also extrapolates out into, okay, what are team conversations? Kind of like you mentioned before, JP. I'm frustrated with these one or two individuals not meeting a team standard. So it's a team conversation versus having an individual conversation. Where that gets complex for me is the number of coaches that, let's say in JP's example, with those one or two individuals, have an individual conversation and yet never relay in some appropriate way that they've had that conversation with the team. So all the team sees is, these one or two players who are out of alignment with team standards not being held accountable because the team has not been part of or witnessed the communication, the conversations that have happened with those individual athletes. So I'm almost seeing like three, or two circles overlapping. And it's like, what is individual coaching, whether it's skill or we're talking about leadership culture? What is the individual, the team, where do they overlap? And then what's exclusively the other? So yeah, I think at this point, I almost have more questions than I do like answers for what is best. And so much of it might come down to context. Where are we in the season? What do we have time and capacity for? What's coming up for us that's getting in the way maybe of team or individual success? And does that drive where and how a coach spends their time?
Yeah, Betsy, you bring up, I think, something that becomes a real problem. It's like a seed for a lot of discontent in a culture, that a coach does work on coaching an individual, but doesn't bring the team into awareness of what is going on there. And it reminds me of a ice hockey coach from American International, one of the more successful Division I programs in the country, Eric Lang. He talked about they have a team standard around like everything is going to be shared here, right? Like there's just this open door policy. When we're talking about discipline and accountability, everything will then be communicated back to the group, because you see coaches are working with certain individuals. They're having empathy and grace and accountability, but players only on the rest of the team only sees grace. They only see, well, they're getting left off the hook. And that creates a lot of problems. I think too, just when I was hearing you talk, Nate, what I think is really important for me is when you say coaching the individual, what does that actually mean? Like for me, that means not telling or giving players lectures and pulling them aside and just a lot of deep mentoring and just telling and sharing my experiences. I really see coaching the individuals as guiding, teaching occasionally, walking alongside them, really asking great questions and having really active listening conversations to support them in their growth. And also sometimes to deliver clear feedback and be transparent about what we're observing, our truths as far as where they are, and I think sometimes that gets lost, right? And when we talk about coaching individual, oftentimes I have a conversation with a coach and they say, well, I had a one-on-one with an individual and, they talk about coaching that individual and I'm, well, how much did the athlete talk? And they're like, well, man, they said maybe a few things, 10%, 15%. I'm like, well, I don't know if you're really coaching them other than just maybe lecturing or telling them. And so that I think it's important to make that distinction here too.
Well, maybe we can wrestle with a couple of scenarios here. And we've all got a basketball background. And I'm sure that having coached and played, you've either been alongside or maybe you've been the guy I'm going to describe here, JP, but that occasionally takes a bad shot. And as a coach, you go through and you talk about, here are the shots that we want in our program. We want open threes and we want semi-contested shots at the rim. And that's what we're working for across the board. But every once in a while, you're going to get a hero on your team that thinks they can take, ones or twos or contested pull-ups or, tough shots at the rim or what have you. And if you don't address that in some way, and there's different ways to do it, right? Like from a team perspective, you just put them on blast and, put the shots up and let's just grade them in front of everybody. I don't know if that's always the best. Maybe sometimes that's appropriate. But how do you go about trying to thread that needle between what is coaching the team? Because it can become contagious. Well, if JP can take bad shots or open threes, I better get mine before he touches the ball again, right? So, that attitude can spread and it can cause some resentment as well sometimes. And at other times, like it may be an individual message. So let's just use that as an example. Bad shot selection by an individual on your team, not meeting the standard. How are you thinking about communicating through something like that?
Yeah, let me jump in here. I think first off, Nate, I never took a bad shot in my life. Like anything that I put up was a good one. Really, I hope coaches in other sports can find the connection, because really it's not, whether it's, being selfish with the ball in soccer and trying to do too much, but even beyond that, I think there's a lesson in this. I really feel like I figured out shot selection later in my coaching career, probably 10 years into it, where I stopped just having a general team standard. And I had a little bit of a team standard of like, hey, we don't shoot these types of shots as a team, like a pull up two, and maybe a few other things. Now, but what I really grew was when I started to sit down and work with every individual to say, hey, these are the shots we want you to shoot. And these are the shots that if you shoot, you're instantly coming out of the game, whether they go in or not. Right. And we had data and to back that up. And when we did that, it was the previous 9 years. I don't know if my like the feedback constantly was my players would be like, well, I'm not sure if it's a good shot or not. Like you'd hear that all the time, or there's confusion, and we would spend time grading the shots after games. And it's like, and it was all of a sudden there was no more confusion. It was so clear, like, because everyone knew on an individual basis, and we had some data to back that up. So it provided clarity by being able to drop into the individual standard. At the same time, I think, there was probably, we had that team standard and there was some sharing of those individual standards. So everyone knew for these players, these were the shots that we were looking to get them, right? Like we wanted this guy to shoot threes on these spots and that. So everyone was kind of aware of each other's individual standards in shot selection, as well as the team standard.
Yeah, and I love that we're going down the basketball path. Unlike JP, I did, as a shooter, take some bad shots. And I was typically the first to own it, like almost maybe even selfishly sometimes, so that coach knew that I knew that that was a bad shot and that it wasn't going to happen again. So please don't take me out. Just thinking about this bad shot selection. And this is, I think, Nate, a great example of that overlap, the intersection of individual and team. Because even in some of the conversations that you had with players, JP, and I know, Nate, you've had similar conversations about what's a good shot for you, right? So it's like you can have a situation in a game where for that individual, it's a good shot. But based on the other individuals on the floor, it's not the best shot for the team. And so it's almost, can we hold multiple truths? And I think about, as a coach, part of my job, especially in competition, is to put players in positions to be successful. And then for the players, their collective job when they're on the floor is to put each other in positions to be successful. So if we're looking at the game film, can we hold multiple truths? Can I pause when, this person who's shooting 44% from three is taking a three and say, is this a good shot for so-and-so, or for what we know about so-and-so? And the team says yes. And then I say, and is this the best shot for us on this particular play? And we're looking at 6'4" under the rim wide open. And it's like, maybe no, like that person's shooting 58% from right underneath the rim. So can we hold multiple truths and really have an open dialogue, that creating that shared awareness of, yes, this is good for me. However, this isn't what's best for us. And where does that come into play? Because you hear it all the time. So-and-so can miss so many shots and they never come out, but I miss one shot and I'm out. It's like, well, so-and-so also does so many other things that really benefit our team and put us in a position to be successful. So is that a dialogue that we're having in a transparent way? And I love what you mentioned about Coach Lang. This is a space where things are shared. How are we sharing the information that creates the shared understanding to allow the team to be successful while also helping individuals grow?
Yeah, Betsy, I like what both of you guys are describing there. In some ways, I see my role as, first of all, offering clarity about how are we making decisions about what a good shot is, right? And you have the data and the analytics to be able to support that in basketball. So that part of it, I think, at least from a logical perspective, makes sense. We're hunting for the highest percentage, highest yield shot that we can find. And it's pretty easy to get everybody on board with that. One of the things that we did some last year, especially later in the season, is you kind of, you get a little bit more larger sample size with what players can make what shots, is that if we have a 42% 3-point shooter with a hand interface on the wing and an open 28% shooter in the corner, we want the 42% shooter to take that shot and not throw the one more, even though we say in practice all the time, we want to look good to great and, make that pass. But that isn't necessarily something that I would say in front of the team. I would talk to the 42% shooter and say, this for you is a good look, and I'd rather you take this. You need to be selfish with some, with the percentage that you're shooting, rather than throw the one more here because of the numbers. And so in some ways, like it's kind of the invisible hand, right, of kind of controlling. And I think in some ways it's translating what's said in front of the team. Now we're translating that to the individual of what it means in their context with their skill set and their role, in this case, in our offense.
Nate, let me ask you, are you also having that conversation with the 28% shooter who's open in the corner, like the next time the 44% shooter shoots with a hand in their face? Because that's also sometimes the conversation I hear from athletes is, I was open in the corner and so-and-so didn't pass it to me. And it's like, ooh, we didn't ever have that one-on-one conversation with the 28% and say, look, even though so-and-so is contested, their percentage dictates that might be the best shot for us, even though, yes, you're open in the corner. So just talk a little bit, if you will, about how you navigate kind of the flip side of that.
Yeah, I mean, in our conversation and the way our shooting numbers work, like if you're over 40, you're a 4, which is a better shot than an open, 32 in the corner. That's a 3. So we do adjust a little bit of who is what on that scale. But I think the other thing that we do is, instead of saying, okay, Josie, you're sitting in the corner there, just waiting with open hands. If we know, in this case, like Sid and Peyton have NASCAR green lights, like if they can see the rim, there's 5 green lights in front of them to shoot it. then you should get an early jump on offensive rebounding before your guy's going to have a chance to close out. Like, so we give them the next opportunity to score, in a sense, like go hunt the long board on the diagonal because you're potentially going to have a chance to get the putback there. And so I think that helps rather than go rot in the corner, and just feel sad that you're not getting the one more. Like, we just here's the next step for you. And that also helps us. And we could do that in front of the team with film because they see the opportunity when the box out's going to be off a long closeout, et cetera. So
that's awesome. And I love, and this is kind of a larger coaching point for those listening, is Nate, what you did really well there is you didn't just tell them what they couldn't do, you told them what they could do, right? It's not just like, well, you can't get the ball in the corner, or you can't shoot that shot. It's, you can be the first one to go hunt. And I think I'd done some work with, the Diamondbacks last spring after the season. And there was a sign in the mental performance office and it said, everyone wants to eat, not everyone wants to hunt. So really like finding out like, yeah, everyone would love to knock down a three, but are you willing to like get in there and mix it up and go get the offensive rebound? I just really appreciate that you in that conversation didn't limit it to, yeah, you're not the best person to take that shot. You expanded it to, here's what you'd be best suited to do in that situation. That's awesome.
Well, let's try to tackle another one here. I don't know if you see this as boys teams, although I think you probably do early in the season, particularly. When a team comes together, oftentimes cliques can form early in the season, just naturally, right? Like the seniors are going to clump together. I remember my first summer camp at Linn-Mar when I took the job. It's the first thing that we've done, right? And we come in the room and I'm literally looking at the gym. The seniors in a circle over here, the juniors in a clump over here, the freshmen are way over on the sideline standing next to the wall, not talking to anybody. The sophomores are in a circle right there. And it took a while to start to integrate the grades together and figure out, we talk about unity, we talk about relationships and investing in each other and all those things. Like, there are barriers that have to be overcome first. And sometimes you have some that aren't necessarily willing to do that, to get outside of their, comfortable relationships, so to speak. And sometimes that can lead to rivalries and all kinds of negative things on your team. So just as a, for instance, again, let's say that we've got 2 or 3 upperclassmen that for whatever reason are dragging their feet when it comes to standards of, unity and intermingling and investing in each other. And everybody sees it. And a couple people might have come to you as a coach and said, these guys, they just don't, for whatever reason, they won't sit with us. They don't talk to us in the hallways. There's a bit of an aspect of coaching team here. And I think there's also the need to coach the individual. So in a situation like that, how would you handle, or where would you start?
So Nate, when you talk about this scenario, and this is a tricky one, right? It's like, is it worth bringing up? I think is what I hear from some coaches, because yes, it's getting in the way. People are noticing, and they're seniors, they're leaders, even though maybe they're not exemplifying great leadership choices or behaviors in the moment. For me personally, a starting point is probably an individual conversation, so we avoid groupthink, of really getting curious about what's getting in the way. Like, what for this individual is the point of resistance about being more inclusive, about welcoming maybe, or demonstrating more of an integrative behavior. What we find sometimes is there's a fear. And I've seen it happen where, especially with a senior or an older member of the team, the fear of getting close with a younger member is that person's already likely to take their position. Like, they already feel threatened by that younger person in a skill capacity to lose their perceived value or position on the team. So there's almost this like aversion to any other type of inclusion because they feel threatened in some way. So if you're culturally experiencing this, my first thought for coaches to really get curious about is what's the resistance about? Like, what's getting in the way for this individual, for this collective group? And then can we start to have that conversation before we talk to them about their need to take certain actions or demonstrate certain behaviors?
Yeah, and I think what Betsy just shared there are some really valuable ways to approach coaching some of those individuals that are struggling with that. I would say the way that I approach it with the team is looking at your leadership system. And so the big thing I advocate for is that your leaders, there's enough leaders in the team to put the team into groups where each leader looks after 3 or 4 individuals. The very selection of those groups, bringing the players that are in the leadership team, leadership council, the captain's council, whatever you call it, giving them the autonomy to make the decisions around who will be in their group, but also communicating that we're not making those decisions around reinforcing cliques. It's about building connections with other people within the team, underclassmen, mentoring those people. So the system itself is designed from the very start of selecting the groups to encourage connections throughout the team. And then it's the processes, it's the weekly check-ins, it's the small group chats, it's the, hey, we're going to do this game, we're going to share hotel rooms based on groups, we're going to sit at these tables occasionally. Like, you're doing things to help nurture those connections. So I would see all that stuff as like coaching the team and that leadership group to be able to do it effectively. And then you're really diving into some individual coaching as well, where you're really trying to figure out what's getting in the way, like Betsy shared, but really challenge that individual at different points to start to see the impact of their kind of clicks on the overall experience for every athlete.
Yeah, I think that's all good. When we started there, one of the things, and I hear this, this idea of extreme ownership, and Shaka mentioned that in our conversation with him too, is that starting from a place of the expectation, was it clear what I was intended to communicate in the beginning? So starting in this new program, we start out, look, we expect that we're going to treat each other the same. We're going to value each other. We're going to build those connections. We don't know what love means, but we're going to interact in a way where we're building each other up and investing each other. And I'm going to put you in situations where we're going to just mix the groups. And so whether that's speed dating or team dinners where there's, randomly sitting with people, or shooting in pre-practice, they're randomly, selected, or they can't shoot with somebody from their own class or whatever it might be, like both giving the why, here's why I think this is valuable for our team and for our program. And I'm just going to throw you in some situations. And usually that's enough, right, to start people to get to know each other and feel a little bit more comfortable. But then I think one sort of non-threatening way to coach individuals that maybe struggle with that, and it could be any number of reasons. I mean, they could be shy, or they played with their 2 best friends since they were in 2nd grade. Like, there's all kinds of reasons that cliques form, or players refuse to connect with other people. But in those individual meetings, not to throw the previous coach under the bus all the time, but why not? They're not in the room, just asking them, have you guys done this in the past? Like, is this something, did you do team dinners with the freshmen before? Almost innocently, knowing that they didn't. And then, well, how is that different for you? Like, is the vibe different? I mean, just a curiosity of like, what's the experience like for you now when I'm asking you to do something that hasn't been an expectation or existed before? And I think that's an easy way to express curiosity, to better understand that individual, and puts a little bit of on me, like, I'm asking you to do this and I didn't really get your permission, but how's it going? Versus, Betsy, why won't you talk to Sally? Like, of just like going ahead on right at it, as though I just see the problem and I'm going to go attack it without really understanding it.
Yeah, 2 things that come up for me, both as you're talking, Nate and JP, is one, this visual from social media of 2 kids. It was a brother and sister in this like oversized t-shirt, and the shirt says, "This is our figure it out shirt," but they're stuffed into the same shirt, right? So it's like they have to figure it out because their exasperated parent has said, until you figure it out, you have to wear this. The other thing that comes up for me is, you mentioned like, why aren't you so-and-so, right? So right away, just the phrasing of the question, that why, even though our desire is to understand, can cause unintentionally some defensiveness. One way I like to navigate that is to ask, thinking about future positive, productive, is what needs to be true for you to feel more comfortable, interacting with this person. The what needs to be true question can serve so many purposes, and it gives us the same insight as to why won't you so-and-so, but it's focused in a very different direction. Instead of going historically of what's been true in the past, we're asking them to be proactive and collaborative about what needs to change or be true in the future in order to have a different experience.
Yeah, that's really good. And, another thing that comes up sometimes with players, especially, well, this probably happens at all levels, but I can definitely identify with this at the high school level, is, we often talk, JP, about the continuum between a performance athlete and a recreational athlete. And that informs their goals and their objectives and what they want out of their playing career, and also what they want out of their experience, right? So if you have a high level performance athlete that wants to get to the next level, whatever that is, their commitment, their typically off-season commitment is going to be, greater investment than somebody that's there to enjoy their high school experience. And both of those are valid. And yet here we are trying to figure out, how do we create a plan and coach a team where, I've got 5 basketball first kids and I've got 7 multi-sport athletes where basketball is the second or third sport. And I have maybe 1 or 2 girls that are out because they want to hang out with their friends, or they don't want to be at home with their parents. So, what do we do when you've got a roster like with that kind of diversity when it comes to their commitment level? And again, I think this is a place where coaching the players becomes really important.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a quick example that's going to show them probably one of the more extreme ways this can play out, but it applies to everyone. So I was recently with a very successful state championship field hockey team, and they on that team have players. One is on, I think at least one is on the Olympic under 18 or the international like USA under 18 team. There are some players that are going to be college Division I scholarship players for field hockey, and then there's some that probably won't play on the team this year and are just there for the experience. And yet they have a team goal to win on our state championship. Now you have individuals with different goals. Some might want to just make the roster. Some might want to get playing time. Others want to, probably go play pro. Some want to get a college scholarship, right? So you have all these individual team goals. And then on the other side of that, you have the reality of some girls are willing to sacrifice and make a high level of commitment, and some are not willing to make that much of a sacrifice. And so you're dealing with all these things within the team dynamic. So how do you coach a team like that? Now, that could be, I've seen examples, smaller examples of that, like in Division I athletics, right? There's players that are trying to go play pro, and there's some that are trying to make the roster, and there's varying levels of commitment, and we all want to win a championship, but some don't really care that much about winning the championship as others. And so how do you navigate that? Well, there's ways that you coach the team and the individual. When you coach the team, the way that I like to do this is to agree upon some common goals, or even just what do we hope to experience being a part of this team. And then I love to break it down with teams into, hey, if that's our goals, if that's what we want to experience, what can we not tolerate in this program? What do we expect of everyone here? And then what are we striving for? What does excellence look like? So here you can kind of start to get some varying, like there's acceptable, there's expected, but then here's excellence. Like this is really where we want to move the needle to. And we're welcoming everybody into that, but we're not going to tolerate down here. Now, within that, that's great, but there also has to be a lot of individual coaching, because I would almost say that we've talked about performance versus recreational athletes. I would almost even say there's 3 categories now in my mind in a lot of teams. There's high performance, there's performance, and there's recreational. And, the high performance, they've got really, really high goals, and they're really putting everything into that basket. Like they want to make a career out of this sport, and they're willing to do the nutrition, the diet, the sleep, all the little things that you can find out there. Whereas the recreational is looking just for a positive experience. And performance is still probably committed to doing extra outside of the original sessions. But in coaching the individuals, knowing where they are and what pathway they want to be on is probably the foundation. So where are your aspirations and what are you willing to do as far as commitment? And once I know that, then I can step in and coach appropriately without taking into, and this is where it's so nuanced that you can't coach the whole team in that. And so this is the power of individual coaching conversations, potentially putting together personal development plans for those athletes, so you can really work with them to help coach them on these types of commitments to achieve what they want to achieve.
Yeah, that's super helpful to understand. And again, looking at everything through a communication lens, all of this is information. However, we're so quick to make judgments about that information, right? It's like, senior player, this is my last go around. I want to win a state championship. You freshman coming in just want to have fun and make friends. Like, you need to get on my level. And it's like, no, if we can understand what level they're at and then work with them from that level. And I was writing down as you all were talking, just a couple different E's. So expectations, right? Like, what is your expectation for the experience? We can almost relate experience and expectations together. Based off of the experience I'm here to have, I want to be a high performer. I want to be a performer. I want to be a participant. What are the expectations that your teammates have of you and that we can have of you as coaches? And then that informs, where do I as a coach put my energy? So that's another E one, is like, based on the expectations that I have for this individual in the context of our team and our team goals, I'm now going to allocate my energy appropriately. And I see it so often where you've got these, let's say, participant level athletes that coaches are devoting so much energy to because they are like, well, we can only go as fast as our bottom people. Yes, and doesn't have to be true that way. What if you invested that energy into, the 18 of 20 people, the 18 other people that are committed to the high performance goals that you have? And then the last category of E that comes up for me would be extra. So even if we think of, okay, these are 2 of 20 that just want to be participants, what would be extra for them to do? Like, if they wanted to really support the team, what could they do that would add value outside of their participant category? And then thinking about like base level, and I think Nate, you and I have talked about this before, is do no harm. Like, look, you don't have to want to be a high performer and to put in all those additional hours and sacrifice. Simply what we're asking of you, the expectation we're setting here is, don't keep our team from, doing that. If you need to be done after a certain time, if you're not here to tack on extra reps, but whether it's your attitude, whether it's your commitment, whatever it happens to be, if extra is not in your expectations wheelhouse, we're not going to devote our energy there. And also, please be mindful that in what you are or aren't willing to do, you're not harming the team for the relative goals that we have together.
Betsy, I'm going to add one more E there, and that's acceptance. And I know that's actually spelled with an A, but one of the things that is challenging, I think, for coaches when we start to have these conversations is that I'm thinking of players that basketball is their third sport. They're probably going to be able to play a role for us at some point. 10 years ago, my message to the team would be, you have to be committed at this level. You have to come in and do these things to be part of the team for us to get to this place. And so all of my communication, even individually, was not to accept where that person was or where basketball was in that person's life. It was to try to push them from being a recreational to being a performing recreational type player, and like continuing to, if you're going to go in and do this much for volleyball, why aren't you doing this much for basketball? That sort of mentality, which was destructive, really.
How'd that work out? Yeah. How'd that work out for you?
And a lot of those kids we would lose, right? Because we don't just acknowledge and accept this is where they're at and how do we work with them here. And I think one way, and this is not to be a defeatist here, but it's been a good intellectual challenge for me, is to think about a kid like that and say, well, if this is all we could get from her, how do we get the most from her? And that is a completely different way of thinking about coaching that individual than just how can we get more? How can we get more? How can we get more? And I think that, and this is a whole nother tangent that maybe we can talk about another time, but, for athletic departments that are fighting over multi-sport kids, the lack of accepting what a kid wants and supporting that is probably the crux of a lot of the conflict, even between, football and basketball, or volleyball and basketball, or softball, or what have you. And I think that's hard for coaches to just accept. Here's where they are, and now how can we work with them?
Yeah, Nate, what your point there, it's so applicable to so many different elements of our program. And oftentimes we think, if we want to raise the standard in our program, we got to start with the least committed players and work upwards from there. When it's like, hey, how about if everyone's, if the standard is everyone's on time, you start working with some of your performance players to start showing up 15, 30 minutes to get extra work in. And when you do that, oftentimes those will pull some of the laggers behind, or the laggers with them, to be more guys start showing up early, right? If you want to drive off-season attendance, right? Like, just rather than, starting with the players that you're most concerned aren't going to make any workouts, just start with the players that are committed and creating a good environment, and more people want to join that. If you want to start doing mental training with your team, sometimes that's a big thing, big thing to start within your program, like 15 minutes of visualization or mindfulness routines before. And I think it's great for everybody, but depending on your context, you may not be able to do that for everybody. But you can start with a few that are really in that performance category, and more will start to join in, right? It's just starting from that place, I think, is a huge thing. And so I think that's one last thought that I would share with everyone here is that in all of this, as a coach, when we're coaching the team and coaching the individual, I think it's important for us to remember that we have a responsibility to the team often, supersedes our responsibility for individuals. And so we can be coaching up individuals and working with them to try to meet the standards of our program. But at a certain point, oftentimes we have to make hard decisions that are in the best interest of the team. And that isn't always what's in the best interest of that individual in their career. And just being aware of that and being honest with that, with players, with their players' parents, I think that's really, really important. Hey, I'm with you. I'm here to support you. But at the end of the day, I still have a greater responsibility to the team. And making that clear can be really, really valuable and may not prevent conflict down the road, but it might help, mitigate that conflict.
And in closing, at the beginning, Nate, when you brought this topic up, and again, great topic, really, I'll say nutrient dense food for thought for coaches as far as how am I coaching the team? How am I coaching the individual? My curious question for folks to consider is, once you identify where you're often coaching the team and where you're often coaching an individual, to ask a follow-up question of, where am I not coaching the team? Where am I not coaching an individual? That would be an opportunity to do so in a way that would matter both to the individual and to the team. So that would be my parting thought for today.
Yeah, and I think coaches, if you're anything like me and you kind of reflect on this observation of the difference between coaching your team and coaching individuals, I've cited for so much of my career on just the group message and players figure it out, or expecting them to figure it out. And I think what I'm learning here, and this conversation has challenged me in a number of ways as well, is that first of all, when a player from a cultural perspective is not meeting a standard, my first question is, what do they not understand, in the sense of, what have I not communicated well? That's a better way to say that. Where have I failed in communicating with this player? Because it could be that simple. They just don't understand because I've failed to communicate. So if I start from that place of ownership, and Shaka talked about that in our conversation, number one, it allows me to take some responsibility there, hopefully, and work from there. I think the second thing is, what do I not understand about this player, is also an informative question that pushes me toward curiosity. And then the last one, what do they need from me to be able to empower them to follow or to meet that expectation, or whatever, the standard might be. That's a framework that we use all the time for skill development in our game. And so I don't think it's foreign to us. I think for me, it's just a matter of taking that same approach and thinking about coaching the character or the character development of our kids in the same way.
So as I look back on my coaching journey, I know that one mistake that I made with some of my better teams, my better team cultures, was that I kind of wrote off the players who failed to make the team or really thrive in that team environment. Now, I'm not suggesting that I could have helped all the players. I could have saved everyone. We can't help everyone. We can't save everyone. I just think that I was a little quick to think, well, 8 or 9 of the players, they figured it out. So the 2 or 3 who never figured it out, well, that's on them. I think today's conversation has encouraged me to think a little bit more often about how might a personalized approach to coaching some of those individuals have helped those athletes, and how it might have even helped the 8 or 9 players who seem to have figured it out and bought in. How might a more personalized approach to coaching, how might us all working harder to coach the individual rather than just coach the team, how might that better serve our athletes? How might it better serve our team and even our mission as a coach? Thanks for listening into the Coaching Culture Podcast. As I mentioned earlier, please be sure to share it with a friend in leadership or coaching, and then have a conversation with them about it. It's one of the best things that you can do to not just promote our work, but to promote the culture that you want to coach in. We don't want listeners. We want people that are engaged with this material, with this content. We want people that want to start conversations in their clubs, athletic departments, and their coaching teams. So we encourage you to reach out, to start the conversation with others out there, to start those discussions. We know ourselves, we're just sharing our perspectives. When you have conversations, you learn from others. And that does so much for your growth as a leader.